If you work remotely, there's a good chance you remember some audio that got leaked earlier this year and went viral.
That a lot of you were on the Zoom and you were doing the following, okay? Looking at your mail, sending texts to each other about what an asshole the other person is, okay? Not paying attention, not reading your stuff, and if you don't think that slows down efficiency, creativity, creates rudeness and stuff, it does. Okay, and when I found out that people are doing that, you don't do that in my goddamn meetings. You go to a meeting with me, you got my attention, you got my focus. I don't bring my goddamn phone. I'm not sending texts to people. Okay, it simply doesn't work. And it doesn't work for creativity. It slows down decision making. And don't give me the shit that work from home Friday works. I call a lot of people on Friday. There's not a goddamn person you get a hold of.
That, of course, is J.P. Morgan Chase CEO Jamie Dimon speaking at a company town hall earlier this year. He was responding to a Chase employee who was commenting on Dimon's recent directive that most Chase employees would have to return to the office 5 days a week. This employee suggested that maybe it would be better left to managers of all the various teams as to whether remote work arrangements might be more suitable to some employees.
There is no chance that I will leave it up to managers. Zero chance. The abuse that took place is extraordinary. But here are the problems, okay? And they are substantial, okay? Which is the young generation is being damaged by this. That means they may or may not be on your particular staff, but they are being left behind. They're being left behind socially, ideas, meeting people. In fact, my guess is most of you live in communities a hell of a lot less diverse than this room. And so it had all these kind of effects. So we actually see these younger kids slowly being left behind. And I won't do that to younger kids. Now, it's hard to say to the younger kids, you come in, but not your bosses.
Dimon's colorful language, of course, got a lot of attention. And he was also widely panned for his sweeping, uncompromising view on remote work. But his remarks did touch on a critical issue to remote teams: trust. On one side, can employees be trusted to be as engaged, hardworking, and productive as their on-site colleagues? And on the other side, can managers be trusted to properly lead, oversee, and respond to their staff remotely, especially toward young, early career employees that need extra guidance and mentorship? And in the face of some trust issues, is the answer to call everyone back to the office? Or can trust be fostered remotely and lead to productivity and engagement that meets or even exceeds that of in-person teams? Welcome to the Thrive Remotely podcast, the show that helps remote workers and digital nomads make the most of their location-independent lives. I'm Eric Fish, and today we're diving into that important but often neglected aspect of remote work: trust, both from the perspective of the remote employer and employee. Our guest to help unpack that is Peggy Kendall, a professor of communication studies at Bethel University in Minnesota, and co-author of the forthcoming book, Trust at a Distance: 6 Strategies for Managing in Remote Workplaces. Peggy has spent decades researching how technology shapes communication, going all the way back to the days of MySpace and even AOL Instant Messenger, which is a platform you probably either don't recognize, or if you're of a very specific age, have some very vivid, if possibly cringy memories from. But these days, a lot of her research is on communication as it relates to remote work. And she also consults for companies and coaches executives on how to communicate more effectively and build good, trust-filled cultures. So today she'll share some insights from her research on remote teams, why a lot of remote workers feel neglected and isolated, or conversely, micromanaged. And she'll talk about some of the subtle but powerful ways communication habits can either build or destroy trust in the virtual workplace. We'll also touch a bit on how remote employees' career progression can suffer from proximity bias, and how sometimes they can take things a bit too far in trying to establish trust on their end, like with digital presenteeism and being too available. Peggy began by recounting a study she was part of that involved talking to a lot of remote workers.
We had so many employees tell us stories of being marginalized, of being micromanaged, of being forgotten about, of being just kind of assume that you know what's going on and what's happening. And through all that, it's like, you know what? The remote workplace is different, and communication is different in the remote workplace than it is face-to-face. And I felt like I had done research in the past. I understood certain kinds of theories. Then I got connected with the trust expert, David Horsager, and he has tons of experience with Fortune 500 executives, and they were saying some of the exact same things. So that's sort of how we got into this whole thing.
So you said you were talking to people that kind of felt left behind, isolated. And that was so a while back now when we started doing this. How has that evolved? Like, do you see a lot of improvement in that realm?
That particular study was done about 2 years ago. So that was after COVID. And I think that was probably the biggest motivator. The stories I heard some of them were heartbreaking. I mean, especially some of the recent graduates never had a job, super excited about like, oh, they got their big job. And now they're sitting all by themselves in their little bedroom and they don't have a clue what's going on or what's happening or how they're doing. And some of them just, you could tell that they still hadn't really recovered from some of those experiences. But I'll tell you what, almost every single person we talked to, every one of them had these stories about bad managers. But every single person we talked with said, but you know what? I'm not going back. I am not going back to the office. And if they make me go back full time, I'm going to find another place to work. Like, well, there must be something about remote work that, I don't know, is tuning into the needs of people.
You hear a lot, like there's a lot of return to office pushes now, whether it's 2-3 days a week or full 5 days a week. And you hear a lot of company leaders say stuff like this, like there's no substitute for in-person interaction, collaboration. And some, like you mentioned, like even cite younger, early career people saying, well, there's no chance for them to be mentored, for them to get into corporate life without being in person. Do you think there's merit to this?
Well, I do. I work with 20, 21-year-olds, and I meet with them after they graduate and have some of them that went straight into remote work. I do think there's a concern that they've never really had an office job, and how are they going to get noticed if organizations are not intentionally mentoring online workers? That being said, I think there's plenty of ways for the remote workplace, people working remotely, to find ways to be seen, to find mentors. I think organizations can be super strategic about how do we collaborate? What are some creative ways that we can collaborate? How can we protect those people who are working remotely? How can we pour into them, support them, and help them grow in their careers? Because it's not going to happen as naturally as it would. So I think it's more difficult. I think trust takes time. It takes longer to build remotely, but that doesn't mean it can't happen. One of the people that I work with, he says, you save a lot of money by not having a physical office space, but you have to have part of that budget that you're saving, you have to put it back into having at least some face-to-face experiences for most or all of the workplace. So that might be one on-site a year, maybe each quarter, you have teams get together or whatever it is. So I think there's a way to do both, but I don't think the remote workplace is automatically someplace that you can't connect and you can't be part of a vibrant culture, because I've seen it happen. I've seen organizations that are absolutely have awesome cultures and people love working there.
So it seems like you're saying it takes some intentionality as opposed to just saying, we've got Zoom, we've got Slack, now go collaborate. You have to be a little bit more proactive in fostering relationships and good communication. Now, you started to brush up against this concept and the title of your forthcoming book, Building Trust at a Distance. So can you get into that a little bit more? What does that mean?
Yeah. So the co-author that I've worked with is an expert in trust. And he had all these CEOs that would come up to him after a big keynote and say, but how does this work in a remote workplace? And the more we talked about it, it's like, it is different. The remote workplace is different. And I think there's two things in particular. I think information, you don't have as much information when you're working remotely. You don't have things like just the nonverbal communication. You don't see things, as you're sitting there, overhear conversations. You don't have all of those little pieces of relational information. A lot of times you don't get information. Information flow doesn't happen as naturally. So I think there's a deficit of information online. And I think building relationships remotely takes time, and it needs to be intentional. So you got those two things that are really different. So then the question is, how do you build trust in that kind of workplace? Because a lot of times people are really good leaders face to face. They know how to build trust. They know how to do these things. They get into a remote workplace and it doesn't happen. Like one of the things we talk about in the book is like, as a teacher, when I'm in the university, I have an open door policy. And if students want to talk to me, they can just drop by. Well, an open door policy doesn't work when there's no doors, right? In the remote workplace, that kind of thing doesn't happen. So we need to be so much more intentional about information. We need to clearly amplify our communication. We need to clearly be intentional about building relationships. And then in the book, we also talk a lot about something that we call accountable autonomy. And accountable autonomy has to do with this idea that it's super great when we can trust employees to do the job and like just let them do, be their own person. But we know in real life that doesn't always work. So I think if trust is going to be built in the remote workplace, you have to have consistent, clear understanding of what is expected of employees, whether that's like OKRs or, goals or whatever. And I think you have to have much more communication because we have so much less information. So more information, maybe that's regular check-ins. You can't assume people know things. And I think the other thing is sort of a change in mindset because we don't have the information like we would in a face-to-face situation. We make so many assumptions when we're working online. We fill in the blanks. Like we don't know exactly why someone said something. So we just assume things. Like we assume why they did things, what they did, what they meant by that. And if we're not careful in the remote workplace, I think assumptions can really overtake reality. So that's why intentional communication kind of gets things back in order where it's like, here's reality, here's your assumptions, and aligns those just a little bit better.
So on the other hand, then, what are some common things that, I guess on either side, that employers or employees do that breed mistrust at a distance?
Oh, that's good. What damages trust? In the study that we did, this is what we found. Almost everybody talked about managers that seem so busy. And they seem so busy, so I was going to ask them a question, but they seemed really busy. So then we really leaned into that. Like, okay, how are they communicating they're too busy for you? Did they say, like, I'm just too busy right now, I can't answer that question? No. But I just could tell that they were busy. And it was just things like checking emails during Zoom calls, missing check-ins, canceling check-ins. One of my favorites is we had this meeting and it's like, okay, I think, okay, this is what we're going to do. And we each have kind of an idea. And then he's off to the next meeting before we're like, wait, what was I supposed to do? When is it going to be due? What am I supposed to do with this? So before like signing off, like, all right, let's make sure everybody understands where we're going and how we're going to do this. So just little things like that. Oh, and other things like sending emails full of misspellings or cryptic emails like K. Well, what does that mean? On a Slack, like, what? Question mark. It's like, oh my gosh, are they mad at me? Are they, what's going on? So it's like all these little pieces, all these little behaviors communicate so much more in a remote setting than they would if we were sitting face to face and I could see, you're not mad at me. You're just like, you think I'm important, but you just got a phone call. So, I get that. So I think there's these little pieces, these little communication things that we do when we're not paying attention that communicate so loudly to people, you are not that important. And it's like, we got to catch those little things because people see that and they interpret that. And that's the kind of messaging they get, that you're too busy for me. So I think that's a huge killer of trust, actually, is just these little things that we do. Probably another one that I've seen is micromanagement. When a boss clearly does not trust the people that are working for him or her. And, there's all sorts of technology that will kind of track people's work habits. I read an interesting study not too long ago, and they said that micromanagement actually has the exact opposite impact, because when I feel like I'm being so controlled by someone, they called it a moral disengagement. So in other words, I no longer feel personally responsible for what I'm doing. And especially if I'm a little ticked off that I feel so controlled, I will do whatever it takes to get you off of my back. And so in many ways, micromanagement is exactly the opposite of the kinds of things that are going to build trust, right?
Yeah. Yeah, they're all these creepy software things to spy on people. Like, I've heard of ones where, like, the camera's always on. It'll take a picture of you every minute, make sure you're still in your seat, and tracking your keyboard and your mouse movements. But yeah, I've heard a lot of people that just incentivizes them to sit there all day in horror, basically, and just make sure they're moving stuff around. It looks like they're working.
And it is interesting, like on Reddit, one of the top Reddit threads is how to get around management software like that.
Yeah, you're incentivizing people to game the system.
Exactly.
So I guess that kind of slides into the other side of this equation of trust on the employee side. I know as a remote worker, I've often felt like there's already one strike against me in terms of trust. Like, it is a privileged position, or maybe it shouldn't be considered that, but I think a lot of people do consider it privileged, and they really feel the need to always show that they're working, that they're as productive, if not more productive than their colleagues. Do you think that, first of all, would you agree with that most employees even have one strike against them, basically, if they're remote and most of their company is not? And how do you think that affects the way that people work?
That is such an insightful question, because I think that's true that you've got that proximity bias, right? People that you hang out with and see every day, you're going to pay more attention to. You're going to know them better. And therefore, when opportunities come up, you'll be like, oh yeah, they'd be perfect for it. So I think there is definitely a proximity bias. In fact, one of the studies I was working on suggested that remote employees oftentimes work at least 45 minutes more per day and are, X amount more productive, yet receive 17% fewer promotions, mentorship opportunities, things like that. So I think if the manager is not aware of the impact of proximity bias and has really structured ways of figuring out opportunities, how to mentor someone, how to promote someone, absolutely, I think we run a risk of being devalued sometimes when we're remote, especially when other people are in the office full time. But then you bring up a super interesting question. Does that mean we have to just be working all the time to show people that we really are committed? Because that doesn't seem like a good answer to that particular issue. I was talking to an executive last week, and she said they actually don't allow early career people to be online. But the more experienced people, they give that opportunity because they're probably a little more valuable as far as like what they add to the company because, they have more experience and are probably high performers, and they kind of know how to navigate some of these things. And yeah, so, okay, can I just ask you a question? So what do you think? Because people working remotely absolutely struggle with being on all the time. Like, how do you quit?
Yeah, this term that I learned not too long ago, digital presenteeism, where you're just constantly signaling that you're present one way or another, making sure your Slack is always on active, making sure you're in every single meeting, even proactively setting meetings so your face is seen all the time. Yeah, and it's real. It's like I said, you can feel privileged and lucky and like you're already starting behind in the race. And like you said, you cited those stats. It is a very real thing that you're at a disadvantage professionally by being remote. So I think, yeah, there is a pressure on a lot of people to proactively show that they're there, that they're valuable. And I think that's, to some extent, at least in my situation, it's been good in that it has driven more achievement and that I've actually achieved more being driven by this. But yeah, the presenteeism, like it does for a lot of people I know get to the point where they're attending useless meetings that are taking away from their productivity. And just, yeah, I guess it's a fine line between showing actual achievement and digital presenteeism where you're not actually accomplishing anything except showing people.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me, it kind of gets back to this idea. We rely so much on assumptions when we're working with the remote workplace. And we just have to get better at using words instead of assuming people are going to figure this out, right? So instead of just always showing up and just assuming that's what it takes, I don't know, at some point it seems like there needs to be discussions that take place. Like, how can we make sure that in-person and remote people are being treated equitably and have the same opportunities and have the same expectations? Because I know I'm checking emails before I go to bed. I'm doing stuff, right after dinner. It's like, yeah, that's not healthy. That's not helpful.
I guess some of the things we're talking about could butt heads at some point. Like, it's obviously necessary that employers check in with their remote employees periodically. But then there's also the possibility of overdoing it and brushing up against that line of micromanaging. And Zoom fatigue is also a thing to think about that can wear you down eventually if you're imposing check-ins that are too frequent and too lengthy. So where do you think the balance is? Say you have an employee, say their early career. Do you check in with them on Zoom every day, every week, every month? Is it bespoke? What do you think the balance is?
Yeah. In the book, we talk a lot about the value of checking in. And, these check-ins don't have to be like, okay, now we're going to meet for an hour and we're going to go over everything that you did and all of your questions. If you have predictable and you actually show up, you have predictable check-ins and you kind of cover the same things. Like we suggest you use the same kinds of questions every single time. These check-ins can be 5-10 minutes, and if there's something that's really big that happens, then you can schedule another time. But just being available and checking in can be enough to allow someone to ask their questions, to feel like they're being seen. So it doesn't have to take a ton of time. Maybe it's 5-10 minutes. For early career, I think you have to do it more often, clearly. And I do think that you have to kind of gear up, right? So a new person into the organization, you meet with them. Maybe you meet with them every morning. Like, what questions came up yesterday? What are you going to work on today? That sounds great. Hey, this report looked a little bit, could you tweak it here and there? And so maybe it's 10-15 minute thing every day. And then it's like, oh, they seem to be getting the hang of it. So then once a week. One of the suggestions that a lot of people made was having group check-ins, right? So you have 4 or 5 people, and it might take just a little bit longer, but it doesn't necessarily have to take longer. So I think, especially with early career people, I do think you have to kind of empower them, make sure that they're doing okay, and don't assume that they're going to be good at this remote thing right away.
I guess kind of related to that, you've written on this topic of psychological safety in teams. Can you go into that a little bit, what that means?
Well, psychological safety and trust, I think, are pretty similar. And when you don't have psychological safety in a team, if you screw up, you're not going to say anything. If you have a question, don't quite understand, you're not going to say anything. And if you have a crazy idea that you think is going to be awesome, no, you probably won't say anything because you don't feel safe. You feel like if it doesn't work, people are going to think badly about you or there's going to be some sort of consequences. So psychologically safe team is one where when people fail, it's not the end of the world. You talk about it, right? You're a little bit more authentic. I think, especially in the remote workplace, you're able to use words to express some of the emotions that usually we just express non-verbally. So once you get used to kind of actually, not like a therapy session, but like, okay, I'll be honest, I did not understand that. Like that's a huge risk. I remember I was working at this firm and I was just starting out. I didn't know these people. And I totally screwed up. We were doing interviews. I interviewed the wrong person and I did the wrong interview. And I was just mortified. And when we got together, it's like, oh, should I tell people? No, they're going to think I'm such a loser. Like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? And it took me a couple of times, like a couple of meetings. And eventually I was like, oh, you guys. So this is what I did. And right away, someone else is like, oh my gosh, I did the same thing. Right. And then someone else is like, oh, that was such an easy mistake. Don't even worry about it. And then as we talked, it was like, you know what? We need to track this better. And we recreated the whole system and we made the whole thing so much better and more clear. And that's the benefit of a psychologically safe team, right? You can improve things. You can be creative and innovative. And you can feel heard and you begin to trust the people that you're working with.
So you have a book coming out in November called Trust at a Distance, 6 Strategies for Managing in Remote Workspaces. What can you tell us about that and those 6 strategies?
These strategies were created from the research that I had done, from the discussions that my co-author, David Horsager, had done. And then we came together and we interviewed all sorts of CEOs and executives about what they thought worked, what needed to happen. And we came up with 6 different strategies. So let me just kind of rapid fire. Amplify communication. In other words, more communication. Over communication is actually what communication needs to be in the remote workplace. Clarify direction. Mission, vision, values. Those are so important when people are off working by themselves. Build predictability. That's those check-ins where they know exactly when they're going to talk to you and how they're going to get feedback. Redefining accountability. It's not how much time they're working, it's what they're getting done. Connections. And then equipping your people. And that has to do with career development and some of those kinds of things. So amplify communication, clarify direction, build predictability, redefine accountability, and create connection and equip your people. So those are the strategies that we believe will actually build trust at a distance.
That again was Peggy Kendall, Professor of Communication Studies at Bethel University. Thank you so much to Professor Kendall for taking the time to chat with us. Her forthcoming book, again, is called Trust at a Distance, 6 Strategies for Managing in Remote Workspaces, and that'll be out in November 2025. We'll put a link to that in the show notes, as well as a link to her website, peggykendall.com, where you can find more of her work. And we'll put a link to the other study mentioned today from the Harvard Business Review that found monitoring employees makes them more likely to break the rules. And on our end, please do check out all that we do here at Thrive Remotely, including a weekly newsletter, retreats, and in-person remote worker social groups in many different cities. You can start by going to news.thriveremotely.io. And of course, we'd love you to keep listening to this podcast. We've got several other episodes up already related to various aspects of remote work and digital nomading. If you're not subscribed already, you can find us on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, and pretty much anywhere you normally get podcasts. And while you're there, if you wouldn't mind giving us a rating and review, we'd be ever so grateful. For Thrive Remotely, I'm Eric Fish. Thanks for listening.